Yeah, ready. Okay, it's probably.
I can't resist showing you. I got something in the mail today, which after I had eye problems for 2 years, I couldn't bike outdoors. So I started biking outdoors a year ago. Biked every day for 3 months, then more for 3 more months. End of the summer, first time I won this. So state champion pro racing. Not because of athletic competition narrowly, but because of the conception of health and improvement and creativity. I don't ride bikes to be first. I ride bikes because I think better and I write better papers and books. Okay, that's my message. Relation, in a sense, there with narrower individualism with broader impacts for others is a big theme in Tocqueville. So Tocqueville is our critical link today, but we want to link Tocqueville back and forth to Genghis Khan, China, the rest of the world. How do the West and the East connect, and in what ways that are not so totally unique? These are not just regional. There are differences which we find interpenetrating both activities in China and how to fight the virus, and in the West, where there are proceedings going on right now on impeaching President Trump. How do these connect? One way to talk about it is to articulate 3 kinds of political systems and to link them in turn to underlying values. We can talk about clientelism, which, at least in Marx's theory, was related to agriculture. As you have the connection between, and this was the manor house and the followers, that built a political support, that clientelism, helping people in all aspects of their lives and their children, and this legitimated the political system of hierarchy as shown by Conservative Party voting among the English. In terms of the, well, let me just push on. Manufacturing, and this is the Marxist theory, in turn leads to class and class politics, class relations, building on the conflicts in the industrial workplace. You have owners, capitalists versus proletarian workers, and as that feeds into class or a more qualified version of class politics, as you have in Lipset even, this undermines the other relationships. Which were labeled, as we discussed in the young Marx introduction, which I gave you. That is, the young Marx said, alienation from the established hierarchy follows as you learn more about false consciousness. You have false consciousness if you think you're part of the elite, but in fact you're not. You're really a worker. And so, in that sense, class is the scientifically, historically correct, which was stressed by the Mensheviks in Russia, that we must wait for the historical period to permit the revolution. We cannot have a class conflict and overthrow capitalism because we're not ready. You know, we are a quasi-feudal agricultural society in Russia at the time. And the same was even more true in China in 1945. So the answer was we must force history ahead faster, and we have to use stronger force. The Western analog, which ironically did not appear in our maps of empires, because it was so small in global perspective. But in terms of Hegel, in terms of Beethoven, in terms of the Jews of Germany and Eastern Europe, they felt liberated by what? Napoleon. Napoleon was the military carrier of the French Revolution. So the three ideals of the French Revolution, equality, fraternity, unity, joining together in the French Revolution were brought by Napoleon's army. And why was it so successful? The potential argument here, which I'm making maybe for the first time, was Genghis Khan. There was a little section in the video. Genghis Khan's army included the small units, maybe 10 people, and it said if one person deserted, they would all be killed. But they would elect their leader. Similarly, the next larger units would they would choose their leaders. Genghis Khan's army had a bottom-up component at the bottom and the middle. It was only at the top that the generals were chosen and strongly followed by Genghis Khan himself. The army was successful, and that has been discussed in turn by the Napoleonic army. Why? How could it have defeated the Germans, the Italians, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Eastern Europe, marched into Russia, gone all the way to Egypt to try to block the Suez Canal so that the British would not be able to get to India? Why was the Napoleonic army so successful? And I would say the simplest answer is the troops felt that they were part of the revolution which Napoleon was trying to implement. Napoleon himself may have had more personal ambitions, which we need not go into. But if we ask why were the troops so engaged and so more successful than the Austro-Hungarian troops or the Italian troops, were that they were fighting against hierarchies of traditional armies, where they said, do this, do that. Whereas the Napoleonic troops felt they were fighting for the future of the world, for the revolution of French 1789 ideals. And these were then implemented by Napoleon, and they hold today in the metric system, in building straight roads, rather than lots of curvy kinds of things. And having the Napoleonic Code, which was a continuation of the Roman law system, but basically having hundreds of laws which were explicit and which applied to everyone who violated the law. In that sense, it was an effort to add the ideals of the Enlightenment, which were stressed by many of the intellectuals in France before the French Revolution, and many argued laid the foundations of the French Revolution. It was for rationalism, and so Hegel himself said, you know, my ideals of rationality are incarnated by Napoleon. Okay, so the point is, you can have a combination of hierarchy and bottom-up grassroots, and if you get the right mix, it can be distinctly powerful. So we don't want to assume or apply too narrowly concepts of hierarchy and egalitarianism, but look at how and why they combine in different kinds of mechanisms. So the third, which I'll just put on here for historic comparison is various, in the background was various types of reform, but in the late 20th century, 21st century, this is the new political culture, this is the third way, this is, hierarchy here is strong, hierarchy here is medium, hierarchy here is low. And a simple characterization of globalization is that it presses down the hierarchy. That globalization undermines the ability of the particularly strong leader to be consistently hierarchical. That's a bit of a simplification, but I want to put it out because these are being actively debated right now. The testimony I heard driving in Washington was Biden, the son of, was Hunter Biden, in his appointment to the gas company in the Ukraine, accepting that position based on knowledge of the Ukraine, based on the gas industry, based on some other technical, specific professional knowledge, and the answer is he was the son of the vice president. Trump, did he sell his personal properties when he became president? Did he leave, did he try to appoint people separate from his family from whom he would take political advice? He used his daughter, his son-in-law, and others. That is, you have an interpenetration in Washington today of elements of clientelism, as well as of class politics, as well as of this NPC, of this kind of reform. But we will elaborate these in another week or so. That is a specific NPC. But I'm stressing now mostly the interpenetration of elements of clientelism and personal relations, and how these are not just history, these are not just feudal, these are here today in ways that we need to try to conceptualize. Yes?
What's the middle one stand for?
Class politics.
Oh, that's the left.
Yeah, manufacturing. Okay. So that was the Marxist theory, but not the not the Bolshevik practice. And so the classic way in which this was captured and written about was Tocqueville. Tocqueville was a French lower level aristocrat. He was seeing around him France becoming democratic, egalitarian, continuing the Napoleonic and the revolutionary tradition. But the big difference from the U.S., of course, was that there was not an aristocratic tradition, there was not a peasantry against which this middle class was reacting. So when Tocqueville came here, he tried to say what is different, and what hit him immediately was, and most of all, was the sense of civic engagement, and that this is, I'm leaving out the subtleties. It's a big fact. Go ahead, question.
Didn't you say like one of the things was like that, because like the way the Constitution is,
Just a little bit louder.
the way the Constitution is now, I think he said that in the preamble it's very clear that like the government gets its power from the people. Something like that.
In the Constitution, what of
In the preamble it says that the government gets its power from the people.
power from the people? Yes, yes, for sure. But that was true in the French Constitution. In the French terms, the question is, how is Tocqueville's big question? Sorry, we can't cough in class. We've recorded. If you have anything, unless you're sure it's an allergy and not a virus, we'll ask you to please watch on YouTube.
Turn off popcorn.
Just popcorn.
Yes.
Only popcorn. Okay, great. Popcorn comes to class. Tocqueville's concern, why is France different from, especially France, because France, more than the other European countries, especially today in the 21st century, as a stronger residue of the state and the hierarchy and the classic aristocratic elements, which are taught in schools and shared more widely than certainly in England or much of the rest of Europe. Okay. Tocqueville's answer was not just egalitarianism, which is stressed in the American and the French Constitution, and which was stressed in the European conception of the welfare state, but rather it was a combination of egalitarianism joined with other things. So egalitarianism, in the classic case he studied in most detail, was Massachusetts small town government, village governments in Massachusetts. And these were the quintessential town meetings, where it was felt at the point was these are not just civic associations, but the town meeting included with it the moral sense that every law-abiding citizen, they were men at the time, but every law-abiding citizen who was a voting member of the town meeting must go to the meeting. You couldn't just be absentee and leave the other people to show up. And so clearly we don't have this today. We've never had 100% turnout. But the degree to which you have, but the point was, in the New England conception, it was immoral. That is, God and religion said, it is your duty to participate, because egalitarianism is not just being told something by others, it is having equal participation of all in the process. Okay, but where and how to implement that has been the subject and is the subject of continuing debate in multiple institutional arrangements. So the New England town meeting was one, but I'm adding that in some cases in New England, as Elazar pointed out, in the constitutions of the towns themselves. Plymouth, Massachusetts, when they arrived, said, we've arrived and we will follow the word of God, and in conjunction with him and with this covenant with God, in the sense of the Moses 10 Commandments, we will, in our political system, require that we will have a town meeting in which we will vote and elect our leaders, and etc. Okay, so there's a combination of the moral with the political in a distinct egalitarian manner, which Tocqueville then said, how is this different from France? And he has many examples, but the simple ones, the two-word way of summarizing what Tocqueville identified is what he initially just called the common good. You then get two examples, and later on in the late 20th century is, well, it was in the mid-20s, was public interest, and then the public good, in the economic conception of Samuelson of the public good. Okay, the idea is that analytically, at least, to separate narrow individual self-interest, economic, moral, other, from the collectivity. And in some cases, as with Adam Smith's analysis, there is no conflict. That if you have proper markets and proper people working together and they trade, they exchange, everybody gets richer, which is a common good, at the same time that the self-interest drives the force ahead. Okay, what Tocqueville pointed out, what then others did, was not everything works through markets. Markets have problems. They leave out clean air. They leave out many of the aspects of the environmental problems, of spreads of disease, as in China right now. These are public goods which are not the responsibility so clearly of any one person or one government in ways that are so identifiable. And so where and how can the common good be joined with the individual selfish activities in ways that make things institutionally successful? All right, the classic example, so basically what you have in this tradition coming up through Samuelson, Chicago, classically trained economist, said, and got a the first economics Nobel Prize for stressing the degree to which markets failed, that markets did not provide common goods, and second, that you could not you could not ask people to vote using standard electoral procedures because people had an incentive to lie, to understate their preference. If you're going to vote simultaneously on taxes, and it will apply to the taxes you might have to pay, people won't say that explicitly. And so therefore, economists for 50 years roughly stayed away from analyzing politics altogether. Then later on, the public choice movement developed, and it has now become roughly, certainly if not the dominant perspective within political science of joining individual motivation with markets and individualistic kinds of market pattern thinking. Others within this tradition have nevertheless said, wait, there are other ways that this could possibly be resolved. And they played with institutions. Well, they started with theories and then started with institutions. Rousseau went to Switzerland and joined with Calvin, aspects of the Calvinist criticism of the Vatican and the Catholic hierarchy in the French state. Calvin said basically, people at the bottom should choose their church leaders, just as Genghis Khan has said, troops at the bottom should choose their leaders. And the ancient Roman armies had done the same. The small town armies of the, I said wrong, I mean Greece, the little Greek armies were also bottom up. We had last quarter Erwin Zimmerman, who got a doctorate here and then has spent his career consulting with local governments in Switzerland, articulate some of what he had been doing and basically and why do we do that? Because the New England conception of government and of leadership, as Tocqueville analyzed it as distinct to America, has been done more purely and more thoroughly in Switzerland than in America. So America is a mixed case. Elazar stresses the three political cultures, which nationally are fighting each other. Even within New England, you don't have as pure a Calvinist kind of conception. That is, within Massachusetts after the mid-19th century, you had battles between the Irish, the Italians, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, etc. So you've got lots of ethnic politics emerging with that. By contrast, in Switzerland, parts of the lowlands of Scotland, parts of the Netherlands, you had more strong and more pure Calvinist implementation. And the Swiss, specifically, have a way of trying to incorporate the common good, not just in, so for instance, how do you deal with, say, the Chicago teachers' strike? The classic approach is the union or the gas company in the Ukraine will approach a leader and say, you know, we can make a little contribution to your political campaign or something of that sort. They try to give a clientelistic private good to political leaders, and they want to have special treatment in policy, which the political leaders can implement. In Chicago is the strongest, visible, most documented case of local clientelism probably in the world, because we have so many, Chicago's been more studied, and this is the classic core of Chicago politics, through Daley One. Daley One was said, you know, why'd you give those contracts to your son's insurance firm? It's a father's duty to help his sons. And that's the classic Chicago clientelist answer. This is good, this is legitimate. You can't expect a father to repudiate his son. Okay. All right, so the Daley's own son, however, reversed that. Why did he reverse it? Because Harold Washington. Harold Washington won, attacking the clientelism of the Daleys and of Jane Byrne. Harold Washington implemented, at least publicly, for public discourse purposes, the importance of what he called political reform, basically not following clientelist procedures. Did he follow it always himself? No, he violated it himself. But the public moral, the power of the moral commitment was so strong that he and others today, Rahm Emanuel and Laurie Lightfoot, the newest mayor, won most of all, I would say, by attacking the corruption of the classic Chicago political leaders. Okay, so how did the Swiss deal with this? One answer is, when you have a hearing, that is, you don't have a deal concluded by one political leader and a union or a neighborhood group that wants a park built for it. Instead, you hold a public hearing by the city council, and the councils are the main units of government in Switzerland. The national government of Switzerland is called a confederation, and it's weak. Does almost nothing. The local governments are the communal and the individual towns. Okay, communes. When there's conflict, what the Swiss do is invite multiple leaders and perspectives to the public hearing. So you would have the teachers' union and a taxpayers' association and a general civic group all represented, because they have conflicts of interest. So yes, conflict of interest exists, but you can try to articulate it and bring it into the political system, as the Swiss do, joining those interests, preferences, whatever, with the political process, so you can have explicitly brought out what should we do and why. What if they, and so the general style of the Swiss is to compromise. Not to say that one is right, the other is wrong, but how can we build a compromise that will include all of the major interests which concern a particular policy? However, if some of the participants, enough of them disagree, and you cannot reach a conclusion, what's the answer? What do? They hold a referendum, and the Swiss hold more referenda than any other country in the world. They take it to citizens, and the council members know, if we cannot agree, this is going to go to the citizens, and will we lose more if this is taken to the citizens? So maybe we better compromise and make a deal with the other people in the room. So that the knowledge that the referendum is there changes the thinking and the discussion of everything else. And in that sense, this is an institutional mechanism which goes further than the New England, Massachusetts version. They don't have so many referenda in Massachusetts, but if they learned about it, maybe they'd move further in that direction. Okay, so so what I'm trying to do is at least to show Tocqueville did not talk about this in a specific sense as explicitly as I'm doing here, in part because the Americans did not separate them out as much as the Swiss did. But today, these are critical as we are having new institutional arrangements being developed all around the world. In countries that have had, say, an authoritarian political leader, they say, we want to have democracy. okay, but what's democracy? How do these things work or fit together? Should we, and very few have said really we want to adopt the Swiss way. So they adopt the American Constitution. The Russians. The Bolsheviks with Lenin, if you read the Russian Constitution after 1917, it reads like the American Constitution. When de Gaulle became president and he created a new constitution with the Fifth Republic, it looks like the American Constitution. The American presidency instead of the prime minister, etc. The point is, the law is not enough. You need to look as well at where and how some of these mechanisms work. And one of the classic examples is the interpenetration of clientelistic concerns, which is, and the answers are not black and white, as evidenced by the division between the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House. The U.S. House says, impeach the president. The Senate says, wait a minute, let's not go so fast. So you have divisions even within the national U.S. government this week. Napoleon, just to give an example or two, Napoleon outlawed civic associations. So through most of the 19th century, it was illegal to create the kinds of core little associations or big associations like trade unions or separate churches or members of a neighborhood association. These kinds of things which were seen as natural and normal in the U.S. or in England or some other countries. Napoleon said, no, we have the state, and the state will drive policy. And so the conception of the all-powerful state was what Tocqueville was then thinking about, criticizing, and thinking, where and how does this work? And the French answer was that the feudal tradition is so strong that we must destroy it with a stronger state. And we need to destroy every element of French feudal thinking. So the French Minister of Education, classically in the 19th and 20th century, would say to a visitor in his office, today every student in France is on page 23 of this history book. And if you go to every school in France in this grade, when they're using this book, they're all reading the same text. Okay, that conception, and this of course you have in Russia, in China, and cultural policy discussions in China today. How can we incorporate elements of bottom-upness with the strong state control, not just of the military and of taxation, but also of the minds, the ideas, the motivations, which is as in the history books. And I'll throw in one thing here briefly. There was a bestseller in the U.S. Written by a woman of ethnic Chinese background who grew up in the Philippines. She came to the U.S., went to Harvard, and she wrote several books. The bestseller was called Tiger Mom. Any of you heard of Tiger Mom?
Yes.
What's the basic argument of the book? She has two daughters. And she herself, the author, says, my mother raised me to be first in class, to beat that little Korean girl who was ahead of me because she was destroying me. If I was second, I was lost. I had to beat her, and so I worked harder and harder until I became first in the class. So she talks about doing that, and her first daughter did the same, and she talks about how proud she was of her first daughter. She was first in everything, etc. Her second daughter said, no, I don't want to be like this. That's nasty. So she then discussed, she has the confidence and the openness to discuss the conflicts within her own family, illustrated by the mother and the two daughters. Okay, She had public debates with the president of Harvard, with David Brooks at Collins, and the classic American answer is, of those and others, is if you make people work too hard at too young an age, you destroy their creativity and their individualism, which can come out in playing games or drawing pictures, especially artistic kinds of things, which is a classic way, which people are now studying to say. So James Heckman here, Nobel Prize winner in economics, expert on the labor force, is saying, why is there discrimination in the labor force? And he's going back to child rearing at age 2, 3, 4, and he's now working in China. And the Chinese government, the local governments are starting schools that follow the practices, the principles and the practices of the Chicago Laboratory School in the name of John Dewey. So they have a John Dewey Association inside China to study how we can have bottom-up student activities encouraged from a younger age. So my point is, these are continuing things within China, within the U.S. There's no clear right or wrong answer, but at least we can try to pull them out in this way. Okay, so point 1 is Tiger Mom. Point 2, which we've also discussed, the author is now professor of law at Yale. She worked on Wall Street for 10 or 20 years. She knows the market patterns and the social context of that. She then is a law professor at Yale, and she's published a book called The World on Fire. Okay, the simple argument is, under the Cold War, we had strong, tough leaders, and they held down within their countries particular conflicts. One of the most dramatic was Yugoslavia. Tito was tough enough, and the Communist Party held down conflicts between the republics of Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, and so forth. However, after the Berlin Wall went down, Tito died, the Yugoslavs said increasingly, no, you can do what you want, and we had civil war. So she has chapters in her book that include Yugoslavia, that include Russia, the multimillionaires within Russia who were making money, and then simultaneous with Muslim conflicts within Russia, which erupted after there was more open democracy in that sense, in some sense. So she's not saying, in both books, she doesn't say one is good and one is bad. She says there are positive and negative aspects of hierarchy and control, and if you give too much control to people at the bottom too soon, you can have civil war, irresponsible children, spoiled kids who have no values. But on the other hand, if you're too authoritarian and you try to beat those values into them, you will alienate them, and they will revolt and turn against you and the establishment. So where and how this mix can be worked out is the tricky question, and I'm pointing out the continuity from Genghis Khan to the successful family, and the debates in public media and in your own family and perhaps your own mind about, who am I? How should I be raised? Am I more individualistic? And then, well, the second reading on the reading list, which does this both individually and institutionally, is by Robert Putnam. It's not his famous book is called Bowling Alone. It's a bad book. It's too simple. Basically, he says, civic associations have gone down, therefore there's a threat to legitimacy of the whole political system. Simple argument. In Making Democracy Work, he contrasts instead the regions of Italy. And one smart thing he did was empirical research. He went around They sent out questionnaire. They sent out a little postcard to the regional officials all over Italy. They said, "Could you please send me a form, a simple government form?" And in some of the parts of northern Italy, north central Italy, they got the form back in the mail the next day or two. Fast, immediate government, good government response, efficient government. Central Italy, they'd sent a second question, no answer. So they sent a second letter, a third letter, no answer. We went further south, and they would then visit also in person. They would go to the local government agents and say, "Could we please get one of these forms?" And the official would say, "We don't know. I don't know what that form is." Southern Italy is the classic example of clientelism and low trust and low Tocquevillian activity. I just mentioned, I interviewed an Italian candidate for the PhD program here last week, and we were talking about how Southern Italy is different, and how Italy in general has a certain style. And I said, and she said, "Oh yes, that's the Italian style." Oh, and I said, "What is that?" "Amoralism familiare." And I said, "Oh, you know where that came from?" "Oh yes, it's an Italian tradition." But the term, oh, I don't know. The term comes from the University of Chicago. Edward Banfield published a book called The Moral Basis of a Backward Society, and his answer was amoral familism. That if you can do things as a family, so the Italians go to church together as a family, much more than the French, for instance. But you ask in surveys, do you believe in God? Do you believe in the Ten Commandments and so forth? No. So they do things which they don't believe in. Amoral familism. Trust is lowest of many of the European countries. Okay, so the Tocquevillian concern is in Putnam. So Putnam is trying to explore, and so Putnam knew about all this. And the core of his book is this Banfield conception in the South, and where and why is this not shared in all of Italy? This is not Italy everywhere. This is specific parts of the South. Okay, so his basic answer is, with the Renaissance, certain cities like Venice and Florence and Genoa began more active trading with the Asians, the Middle Easterners, and then people far off, and they brought into Italy more exotic things, and they began to think in more cosmopolitan manner. And they in turn also created elements of Athenian democracy inside those city-states, as they were called. The city-state of Venice, Genoa, and so forth. So these certain small middle-sized Italian towns and cities created aspects of democracy, which created a political culture where the citizens felt more empowered and more engaged with policies, and they built more trust. Similarly, in the 19th century, the church permitted and encouraged civic associations to extend the church into neighborhoods and into civic and economic activities in some regions of Italy. These were mostly the same ones that had these middle and northern city-states. They did not do this in the South. So Putnam measures across all the regions of Italy the numbers of civic associations in 1830 or so, and shows that these were the causes, or at least they preceded economic development, which happened with manufacturing and lots more over the course of the whole 19th century in Italy. Simultaneously, Victor Emmanuel created a strong national state in the middle of the 19th century. So all from the 19th century through Mussolini through today, you have a strong Italian national state. Did this not erase a short-term bit of you know, local democracy over 200 years? The answer, Putnam basically argues, is no. Those values persist even under a strong state which is imposed on top of you, national media, etc., that the regional differences are very strong in Italy today. And they fit the kind of pattern which fits with, he argues, the Tocquevillian analysis. Okay, this remains controversial, for sure. Within Italy, there's a paper in the American Political Science Review where 30 or so different Italian historians, political scientists, activists criticize and talk about Putnam's analyses, and you can see they have some are Marxists, some are, you know, they're all over the place in terms of causal modeling, but they're amazingly consistent in agreement with Putnam that this is the way it is. We have Amoris and Famiale in Italy, but where did it come from? Not so clear. Okay, so future research may pursue that, but the point is we do have these differences, and they're clear and strong in different parts of the world in ways that we're still analyzing. Okay, let me. Just a related big factor, for instance, for several years I would bring there are two co-authors of Putnam, of Making Democracy Work, and they're both Italian, husband and wife team, and the woman was a professor here at UIC, and I would have her come to class for several years to do this or a similar course, and students would then be able to talk with her about this, how are things happening inside Italy that fit with this book? And so she disagreed with the co-author, Putnam. So Putnam basically said, this is the past and it's not going to change very much. She took the perspective, which I would say I'm closer to, that values also change. You may have a legacy. So Elazar, we pointed out the Elazar legacy, the Max Weber idea that you carry values on your back. But Elazar wanted to work with me because he recognized that values were changing faster, and we needed to include them not as unchanging causes, but as part of a dynamic of a chicken and egg where we have economic development, we'll have political enfranchisement, we'll have new iPhones who do more of this and that. All these things are interpenetrating with the values. So she would say, for instance, we're working with the European Union. The EU is giving extra specific money to people in southern Italy to try to build a civility in a sense of how we can have more citizen participation and build a sense of ethical engagement, which works. Some Italian cities today are giving, just one second, are giving money to artists to work with critical groups within the local governments, especially in southern Italy, to try to articulate citizen concerns that are broader than just the narrow laws, but which will give the citizens a sense of engagement and participation, which artists can do with more emotional power than the city council members. So I mean so we had a session on this. This is as a mechanism of using institutional local practices that differ globally. The Germans do the same thing. They have local civic activities with artists in the league, but it is illegal in Germany to give them any money from the government because the Germans say, we'll bias them. People will say, we're buying the artists if we give them any money. Let them do it on their own. The Italians, so that the Roman woman I talked to said, oh, no, we just got, if they're paid in that way, they will be biased. So in that sense, we've got ambivalent institutional mechanisms, but at least they both flow from the concern of how to empower citizens. Making a quick general point, I'll just say in a sentence, and we see it continuing here. One of the biggest changes since especially 1968 and 1989 is the dramatic increased empowerment of average citizens. Often not led by the citizens, led by some kind of leader, but some kind of leader who is saying, as they did in 1789, the citizens deserve more attention. And we have this populist appeal in Jimmy Carter, in Bill Clinton, in Tony Blair, in Francois Mitterrand in France, in the German Social Democratic Party. And these are going on, and the sense of egalitarianism is being pushed further, not only by these, by these political leaders, but also by media, intellectuals, websites, in ways that I pointed to as street politics is changing things more fast than in the past. Okay, you have a hand up?
Yeah. So I understand that point about millennialism is this, to clarify, you're saying that essentially civic participation is high, but trust in like authority such as the state is low, or like in the case of the example of like, believing in God, no. But then, you go on to say how like Putnam is essentially saying that like civic association precedes modernity. I'm gonna, kind of wrap it up in that term. But the co-author disagrees by saying that like that values change. Could you specify that connection? I didn't understand kind of how their conclusions differ.
That's exactly the concern which led to this book. That is to see this as not just one Italian town, or Germany versus Italy, but this is going on around the world. Okay, this came out most clearly when there was a young Korean here doing a PhD named Seoko Kim. He has a chapter, second chapter, third chapter in the book. And he was working with surveys internationally with the NORC GSS and the ISSP, where they surveyed countries around the world. And he took his native Korea and he looked at the data and he said, Koreans participate, they join civic associations at higher rates than Americans. But if you look at, does civic participation increase trust? Is that, so let me be careful here. He then did, and he's a knowledgeable Asian, so he said, how am I going to measure trust? He said, I want to exclude clientelism and not only talk about I trust people who I know personally, like my father and my mother. I want to deal with trust which is more impersonal and general, not based on personal. And so there are items which ask both. I mean, how much do you trust people you know personally, your neighbors and others? How much do you trust the city council, your local government? How much do you trust the national government? How much do you trust the media, the national military, etc.? These questions are available in Korea and in Italy and in other countries. So what he did was to separate out the local, to take them out and analyze trust in other kinds of relationships, and then to say, how does Tocqueville change? And his answer was, in the US, in Canada, in Northern Europe, that you have the Tocquevillian hypothesis supported. So, if we have here, if we have civic activity leads to trust positively. In Korea, civic activity did not lead to trust when you adjust for the personal relationships. And implicitly, he's saying if you get this zero relationship among all the citizens in Korea, sometimes you will have some which are negative, and some which are positive, so that the net overall balance is 0. Okay, we talked about this for about 5 or 6 years, and many of the chapters are in this book because it doesn't fit the Tocquevillian analysis. Simple, at least the simple Tocquevillian analysis. So the point is, or so one question, which is here in simple chapters. What do the Asians do to build trust? I mean, where and how do you have trust in? And maybe it's not just the American way. And the simple answer is in the title. Karaoke. The Asians, Japan, China, Korea, traditionally, you would have people who work all day into the evening. They break, they'd go to a bar, they'd have a drink, go to a restaurant, have dinner together, the leader and the workers. After dinner, when they'd have a few more drinks, they'd sing and make fun. They'd impersonate different singers and so forth. They'd sing karaoke. And solidarity, at least the one classic argument, emerged based on the work group, which had years and years of continual personal drinking, singing, talking, not just in the workplace, but afterward in the karaoke context. Okay, karaoke has been in decline, it's being transformed, and that's another chapter which we can explore, but I'll leave it blank for now. But I'll simply say that the book has 3 parts. The first is Tocqueville, and it basically shows the Western theory of Tocqueville fails when you go to Asia. That is, right here. Civic activity, 0 trust. However, there may be other things that generate trust, like karaoke. Okay, so I'll leave that open for a second. The second big Western theory we talked about briefly is the Jane Jacobs, Schumpeter, Richard Florida idea that creativity is the new driver of economic development. It is not just land, labor, capital, and management. The key to management is smart management, using your money and your land efficiently. And where and how can you do that? And the answer from Jane Jacobs and the others is new ideas, research and development, better products that will use the funds more efficiently, to go further and have bigger impact and profit short term. Okay, so and that these tend to be people who have the theory came from these economists in the 20th century, but the same theory was there invented in the 19th century by Balzac and Baudelaire in Paris. And they said, artists are the real creators. And if you want, however, to let them create well, don't crush them by the bourgeois family or the state. Let them live in their own neighborhoods where they can be free to do what they want. Okay, so so the classic bohemians, that term popularized by the Italian opera into the 19th century, attracted Americans, Russians, Italians, Spaniards like Picasso. I mean, you have massive, and today many Middle Easterners live in Paris in continuing that kind of tradition. Greenwich Village in New York was a continuation in the interwar years, World War I to II. Today you have little bohemian patches all over the U.S. and in much of Northern Europe, less in Southern Europe, much less in Asia. The family is stronger. The family is weak in Northern Europe. It's middle in Southern Europe in the Catholic tradition. The family is weak in middle in Southern Europe. It's stronger in Asia. And so how does family strength interpenetrate these? generally, I mean, the simple idea is when I personally visited Korean classes and Japanese, I mean, everybody dresses very elegantly. You don't have people, you get a little bit, but you have, it disappeared after 1968, 69, it disappeared in most of Asia. The conception of political reform in Italy and in much of Asia was the concepts of transparency, democracy, and anti-corruption. These are government efficiency kinds of conceptions. They're institutional arrangements and they're laws. But they omitted green hair, bohemianism, gay and lesbian, rights for women. Those kinds of issues were stressed instead in Northern Europe and in the US and in Canada and Australia. So you had, and then later, 10 to 20 years later, these have filtered into Southern Europe and they're filtering now into Asia. So you're getting these by smaller numbers of people. They're more off color, especially in China, but they're there. The Chinese are spreading rumors on the social media about which leader is gay and so forth. That's very new and it's still pretty sensitive. Okay, the three parts of the book are Tocqueville first, second, the bohemian creativity as driver of economic development is a Western theory because especially a Northern European theory which weakens in stronger family societies. And so the third part of the book is how can or have the arts been used to transform these theories in ways that make them work in Asia and elsewhere. And the simple answer I gave you already is karaoke. Second, what they also call in China and Asia today, especially, soft power. Instead of invading militarily, we will send out books. We'll invite people to the theater. We'll make movies. We'll subsidize the cultural policies in ways that will make people want to support what we're doing. This is a classic French government policy for hundreds of years, but it's being now adapted and incorporated more in that manner in Asia. We'll talk about all these a little more as we proceed, but that's the quick set of arguments I want to get out. Got so much reflection here, I can't quite see the time. I think it's
34.
5:34.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Let me add just one more quick example that I've been looking at briefly. Following what I did, that is, the section I presented to you on Genghis Khan and the global empires, I never, I mean, that's new to me. I didn't know about these specifics until 2 weeks ago myself. So I've been reading and learning about some of this stuff. And I just read about something else, which I didn't know about, which is a dramatic illustration of the same point I made about soft power in China, domestically and internationally. And I said the week before that, who killed the most people in the 20th century? Hitler with the Holocaust? No. Mao, Lenin, and Stalin. Stalin especially. Okay. Stalin also sought to attract intellectuals to Moscow. And there were many Russians who left and who went to the West, so he tried to bring them back. The most important musician, the most respected composer was Prokofiev. And he was in Hollywood in the 1930s. He was doing Hollywood stuff, and as was Stravinsky, the two top. So anyway, mid-1930s, he went back to Russia. He collaborated then with the top the top film director in Russia, who was Eisenstein. Eisenstein had done a film of the Russian Revolution in 1917. Dramatic, positive kind of, I shouldn't say positive, celebration of 1917 in St. Petersburg. Prokofiev comes back. He joins up with Eisenstein in 1937 when Hitler was invading Poland, and the fear of the Russians was, damn, that Hitler is getting serious. Mussolini, Franco, these people are fascists. We're communists. This is global conflict. We've got to prepare to fight this enemy. How can we do it? The Napoleonic army. We want. So I haven't seen a lot of discussion of this, but I think it was 1937. They brought that Stalin provided the funds, and the Eisenstein collaborated on a film called Alexander Nevsky. And it was about how it starts with a scene of the residue of Genghis Khan. That you had a Chinese man, or say, careful, Mongol, or part of they then call them the Golden Horde, Asian in background, coming through a part of Russia, and he said, we destroyed your city. You know what we can do? I'll build you a new city here if you'll join my militia and bring your troops. And so Alexander Nevsky says, sorry, I want to stay in my town. I don't want to be in your militia. So he goes on. All right. So then someone says, shouldn't we try to drive out those Tatars? I mean, these Mongols who are still here and who are dominating us for 250 years in Russia. And he said, no, our concern right now is more immediately that the German knights, the crusaders and their horses, and the Swedes can invade us from the west. We must prepare for the west from that invasion. And so the high point of it is then the knights. So you have these armies preparing, and so the Western armies were much bigger, much stronger, tough knights who've been fighting all over the world. And they gallop across a lake, a frozen lake, and in the middle of the lake, the ice collapses. So God was on the side of the Russians. Nevsky triumphed. Okay, so that's film one. Film two was called Ivan. Okay, Ivan was generally known as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan was the first Tsar. Before Ivan, there were no Tsars. There were principalities. There were little regions across Russia. And that's why Genghis Khan could triumph, because there was no Russian state. There was no strong nation, no national army to oppose the Mongols. And so Ivan built the national state. And by crushing, especially in the city of Kazan, Kazan was the biggest, strongest city of the Tatar leadership still inside Russia. And so so that there's the visible military section is following the kind of destruction of the town of Kazan, not as completely, but basically you have so Ivan the Terrible was ruthless in implementing the national state. And as maybe you can see, this was started in 1942, and it came out a little bit after that. So, okay, so Stalin, you can see, building the Soviet Union. Stalin built the USSR. Stalin was then fighting, he's in the middle of fighting Hitler in 1942. This was a message to the Russian people that we must stay together and we must fight the enemies. And it will take brutality, use brutality, if it will advance, our state interests. Okay, so let me stop for questions, and you can look at any of these films. I mean, I couldn't find a good single section, but the cinematography, the music, these are classics, And I would say, has any of you ever heard of or seen these films? Okay. These are minimally known in the West, certainly in the U.S. And the fact that nobody's ever heard of them, okay, I mean, I knew about the first, the one about 1917. I'd never heard of these two until the last few weeks, but okay. So, commentary. In the film, when the Mongol prince is getting back into his carriage, one of his guardians is holding the door open. Then he lies immediately on the ground so that his back will raise up, will create a step. And then the leader steps onto the back, and then he gets into his carriage. So the classic sort of symbolic, hierarchy of the leader is captured in that simple, exaggerated perhaps, but maybe, okay. Commentary. A lot of controversial stuff here, and as I hope you have heard, I'm not saying anything is right or wrong. I'm saying we've got battles which are going on today in Washington that include these same kinds of themes. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you were talking about Platonism coming from the Marx ideas. Could you just expand on
Coming from what?
On Marx's ideas in agriculture and stuff like that? Could you just expand on present-day Platonism?
Okay. All right.
And can I add to
Sure,
this?
go ahead.
If we were to use this lens on Chicago in particular, maybe that would help flesh it
Okay.
out.
Okay, great. Yeah, anything related to that you want to raise? Certainly. Okay. All right. I mean, this is. I came here because of Chicago's urban tradition. The urban tradition of Chicago at the university came from the fact, I would say, that Chicago is seen by most Americans as such a bad place. It's such a scary, I mean, it's had corruption, it's had murder, it's had Al Capone. This is Chicago's tradition internationally. Okay. When Harold Washington ran for election, and he only won because there were two Irish leaders, Jane Byrne and Richie Daley, who divided the Democratic Party. So this is the primary. Within the Democratic primary election, the two Irish candidates divided the Irish Catholic vote, and Harold Washington, the black man, won the primary by 33 1/3 and one vote or two. He then became mayor. And during his campaign, Bill Grimshaw was the campaign manager with his wife Jackie. Grimshaw wrote a speech about reform. And when some citizens heard that, they said, "Hurrah! Reform, Chicago!" And only then did Harold Washington become a reformer. His father had been a machine politician. He had run for mayor twice before and gotten 25 votes or something like that. He was in no way a reformer. But when he saw it worked, he then said, "Okay, let's do it." And but it then became the cornerstone of his entire policy for 4 years, and in ways that institutionalized reform much more successfully, at least attacking the legitimacy. So when the press would say, "We found a corrupt official in your administration," Harold Washington would reply, "I will prosecute him. We, the government, will prosecute that. We will fire him and prosecute him to the full extent of the law to show that we do not endorse clientelism." Okay, that's the opposite of what Mayor Daley I had said, which was, father's duty, help us out. Right? So, at least in the culture of Chicago's politics, there was a transformation. And where and why was Chicago so different in the first place? The name was Daley, and I had a finding when I was studying cities nationally, 10 years before that. It's published in 1975. And I found that, I was studying which city spent more money. I wasn't studying art, I wasn't studying culture, I was studying money. did a book called City Money's Paralysis, the New York Fiscal Crisis. But we said, you know, what causes more government spending and which cities might become more bankrupt, as New York basically was illustrating the problem. And basically, this was the end of the post-1945, the bigger picture. Local government spending was going up in the U.S. after 1945, nonstop until the New York fiscal crisis of 1974 or so. At that point, that is that budgetary decision was transformed. It led to so much national debate and concern that the conception of the welfare state was changed in conjunction with those debates. After it was 74, so I analyzed this with our national data and found that after 74, half of the city governments started cutting their spending. Democratic-led cities were cutting their local budgets after 1974. I gave speeches on this for 4 years, and people threw tomatoes at me. They said, this is ridiculous, it can't be happening. These are Democrats. Everybody knows Democrats are fiscally liberal. Then 1978 came along, which was the California referendum on Proposition 13, where you had the citizens have a referendum. I said there are not that many in the U.S., but in California they do use these more. And 66% of California citizens said, cut property taxes by half. And so they did. And the governor then and today was Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown had campaigned against it. The next day he said, I will, with the full extent of my abilities, confront and challenge the taxation, the overburden we have on the property tax. And so they did. Okay, so my point is then, ever since we've had a challenge of the welfare state, but Jerry Brown illustrates the fact, I mean, I mentioned that he was egalitarian, he refused to live in the governor's mansion, etc. He wanted to be socially liberal and fiscally conservative. And so we had the emergence of this new political culture here. So yeah, up there. With people like Jerry Brown, Peter Flaherty, mayor of Pittsburgh. We had it locally 6 years, 4 years, 3 years before Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan made this nationally, said, I want to be fiscally conservative, and so people said that Ronald Reagan destroyed the American welfare state. Not at all. It was destroyed by the Democrats locally in making it into something which was socially liberal and fiscally conservative. Okay, so the label neoconservative is wrong. Most of these people were not economically narrowly driven. They said, we want to do more, we want to help the disadvantaged, but we don't have enough money to do everything, so we want to do it in a way that is that we can try to be more productive. Okay, we'll talk about that in the next section. But the last piece in part of Chicago and where and why this is different, and why Chicago is Irish Catholic cities spent more. So the paper was called, and I didn't publish it for 7 years. I was an assistant professor. I was worried about getting people angry with me. It was summarized in the New York Times. New York Times and the Boston Globe had headlines, Irish ethnic linked to fiscal chaos. Assistant professor, Terry Clark found. So the lawyers, the Irish Civic Associations of Boston and New York wrote to the president of the University of Chicago and said, fire this guy. But if they didn't read the paper. If you read the paper, it's not anti-Irish at all. It celebrates how the Irish were major, they're the most politically successful leaders in the U.S., but they also use clientelism explicitly and openly. And that's the Irish Catholic tradition is the strongest in the U.S. within those regions, within those, etc. But the Irish themselves, over the 1970s and 80s, have some partially abandoned clientelism. So in the book City Money, we feature 4 cities: Boston, Pittsburgh, Gary, Indiana, and San Diego. And Boston is the classic New Deal democracy. San Diego is the classic Republican. Gary's the ethnic politics city. And the 4th one was the most interesting. We'll talk about it later. Basically, was Pittsburgh, which is the new political culture, where the local Democrats implemented fiscal conservatism, but they tried to do it in a way that was socially and ethnically progressive. Okay, so so the simple answer is the Irish, but not all Irish are that way. And clearly, so Daly 2 broke with Daly 1. And so the Chicago Magazine would attack them both. I mean, Daly 2 got continually attacked by many Chicago media, and others would say, you know, Daly 1, Daly 2, they're the same. Look at me, they wear the same suits. They both grew up in Bridgeport. They talk the same way. They say Chicago. They don't say Chicago. They say Chicago. I mean, they have these silly, un-American accents. They can't be proper leaders. Not my answer is, don't look at their suits, don't look at their accents, look at the policies. And what Daly 2 learned after not in his first year, he didn't run on this at all. He never ran on it. But and we'll have someone come here, and I think we'll help to have a visitor or over Skype, talk about how Daly 2 gradually adopted these same policies as well. So even the Daly family changed is the point. These are not genetic, these are cultural, and culture can change. Okay, that's my quick answer. So we're at the end of the hour. We'll have office hours for anyone who wants. Hello. Which are ones with 3 stars first, and then as much as you can.